So I got a chance to speak with John Kane. John Kane is a Native activist, and we're talking about Interior Secretary Deb Haaland's announcement that the government is going to investigate Indian boarding schools after they found 215 children, or the bodies of those children in Canada. But I got to talking to him. We had this long conversation. You could see where we were maybe not on the same page in some areas. And then at the end, we're like, okay, we're wrapping it up. Goodbye. And then that's when like the best part of the conversation came out, when we were just kind of casually chatting in the green room of Zoom. So stay tuned for that part. You'll see there's like a thanks for watching. And then what do you think about this? I hope you enjoy this. I hope you enjoy this conversation. Don't forget to subscribe. Welcome to the program, everyone. Juliana Forlano here. You can see that we're doing it a little differently today. We had to do it via Zoom with my next guest, but this conversation is so important that we wanted to make sure we had it here for you. So if you excuse the format, I think you'll love the content. So Interior Secretary Deb Haaland has announced that the U.S. government will investigate the dark history of Indian boarding schools and will work to find the remains of children who died in them. The project was sparked after the remains of 215 children were found in March at a residential school in Canada, where a similar program removed children from their homes, from their communities. And we had the same thing here in the United States. Haaland, a former congresswoman from New Mexico and the first Native American to serve as a cabinet secretary last year, introduced the legislation calling for a Truth and Healing Commission into conditions at former Indian boarding schools. Joining us to discuss this turn of events, Native activist John Kane. He is the host of Resistance Radio with John Kane and Regan de Loggans on WBAI and WPFW. And he's also the host of Let's Talk Native, his weekly podcast that I suggest, if you're not listening to already, you go get immediately. John, thanks for joining us today.
Well, Juliana, it's really great to catch up with you again.
I know we both were on WBAI together at the same time for a long time. You're still there. Now I'm over here. So it is great to see you again.
You were a guest on my show.
You were literally the first guest I ever had on any show of mine. So we've got that. So can you give us a little bit about the history of the situation that we're seeing here now?
Well, I mean, look, even on the Canadian side, when they did a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which I was not a big fan of the outcome, really, they characterized it as cultural genocide. Now, there is no such thing as cultural genocide. I mean, nobody was taking away, they weren't just taking away our culture. People died in these schools. So there's no question that almost every one of the five definitions or criteria for meeting the definition of genocide, boarding schools reaches them all. I mean, it's everything from death and creating the conditions that would cease to allow people to exist as those people, removing children, sterilization. I mean, everything you could imagine associated with boarding schools or with genocide is what boarding schools captured. And this was both on the U.S. and the Canadian side, and they existed for 100 years. I mean, some of the schools on the Canadian side didn't close down until the 1990s. The latest one in the United States was, I think, in 1976 or something like that. So these schools had one function, and it was to solve the Indian problem. And in fact, in Carlisle Indian School, which was in Pennsylvania, which was pretty much the flagship of the U.S. Boarding schools. Their motto, and the motto that would essentially go with boarding schools, not just in the United States and Canada, frankly, in Australia, New Zealand, Africa, was essentially kill the Indian, save the man. And killing the Indian still solved their problem, because the problem was the fact that Native people were existing somehow outside of what U.S. was calling civilization. We were not part of the frankly, politicians were calling, we were not a part of the family of humanity, and we were considered less than human. And it was only going to be through this indoctrination of schools, which were government funded and church run. And I think it's important that people realize that this unholy marriage of church and state was really what was behind this stuff. And I know you mentioned in the intro what was found in British Columbia last week, but just a couple of days ago, it made news again because in Saskatchewan, using some of the same technology, which was ground penetrating radar, they've discovered the remains of 751 children who were buried in unmarked graves. Now, we can play semantics of whether we're going to call these mass graves or unmarked graves, and I think there are people playing with those words. And in fact, in this latest situation up in Kawasis First Nations territory, they are suggesting, well, maybe they were marked, but the gravestones have been removed or something.
Oh yeah, they
like
marked
that.
them with paper. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and I'm not even sure how much of that was done. Look, at Carlisle Indian School, they had a graveyard, and there was just shy of 200 graves that have stones. Some of them say unknown because apparently you can attend a school and they might not know who you are, apparently somehow. But I don't, there's been a study. In fact, there was a Dartmouth grad who just a few years ago did an investigation on Carlisle in particular, and suggested that there are far more than 200 graves, because there's like 180, 190 marked graves, but that's not counting the unmarked graves. And the other thing that was noted through investigation, and a lot of this stuff is stored in various documents, was that this colonel or captain, whatever you want to call him, Pratt, who ran the school in Carlisle, PA, when he was sure that a child was not going to make it, he all of a sudden those children would be released to the families. They were stolen from their families in the first place. So he would send all terminally ill children home to die so they wouldn't die on his watch. So,
and perhaps they would, infect, depending on what they had, their communities.
No, that wasn't the concern. They just didn't want them dying. Infection was allowed to run rampant through these places, especially during tuberculosis. I can't imagine what took place during the Spanish flu epidemic. But what this investigator from Dartmouth determined was that Carlisle may be responsible for over as many as 600 deaths, and that's on the U.S. side.
I find it interesting that it's technology that is kind of giving us the ability to look under the land in a big way, to find these basically buried horrible secrets that I'm sure the perpetrators just assumed would just go on being buried and secret forever.
Well, and I think it's important to realize that Canada did their Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and that ended many years ago, or several years ago. These discoveries now are being found by efforts from private individuals, private contractors, and Native people themselves. This isn't a government find. So excuse me if I'm a little skeptical. I know there's a lot of Native people who are raving about Deb Haaland being Interior Secretary. I'm not in that camp. I got to tell you, I mean, I feel like we lose some of our best and brightest. I'm not saying she is one of our best and brightest, but I think we lose some of our best and brightest to who essentially join the other team, as far as I'm concerned. And and I'm talking about this as far as her being a congresswoman and now being an Interior Secretary. Mm-hmm. I don't know. I mean, the initiative that she's calling it, and I know I'm going to make fun of it, right? It's it was called the Federal Indian Boarding School Initiative. I guess if you're give that an acronym, that would be FIBSI.
Funny.
I don't even say much more than that. I mean, but a lot of the times this is lip service. I mean, what are you going to do? How do we, as Native people, reconcile this? I mean, forget about what the government thinks that they're going to do. I mean, nobody is really put a strong initiative on discovering how many bodies have been buried in marked or unmarked graves. I mean, the fact that today, in 2021, they don't have records of this already. And what drove Deb Haaland to do this? The news cycle? Because
what did drive Deb Haaland to do this?
The news cycle, because some bodies are discovered in British Columbia, and all of a sudden now she's announces she didn't do this day one when she got in there, so she's being driven by the news cycle, because when this thing broke on the Canadian side, it immediately got covered on this side. So
well, I mean, whatever pushes these politicians, because politics, as we know, is a dirty business. I think it's really incredible that this is hitting the Washington Post. I mean, I know the Native community papers have been covering this forever, but for it to get attention in the mainstream media, I mean, all the stories they're covering, of course, is, hey, look what happened in Canada. I don't know how much they're going to cover it once it's like, the Catholics all over the place have more dead bodies than just their own, their own children. They've got Native children's blood on their hands as well. Hey, surprise. But the fact that it's coming out right now at the same time that like the Black Lives Matter movement is coming up, what do you make of that? That what can we do with that? Even though maybe she didn't get in there and say, now we're going to do this, that she's been forced and pushed to do this by outside activism, outside events. How can we capitalize on the forces that have started this project to come to a more mainstream coverage?
Well, I mean, has the Catholic Church really been held accountable for what they did to white kids?
No.
I mean, come on.
No.
I mean, it's hard for me to be.
What about what they're still doing to kids?
Well,
they're still doing a lot of stuff.
And I would maintain that part of the foundation of this clergy sex abuse scandal started in these residential schools. Think about it. You had children who the churches, and it isn't just the Catholic Church, by the way. I mean, I'm not letting the Catholic Church off the hook, but it wasn't only Catholic churches that ran these things. But
but it was mostly Catholic churches, wasn't it? Mostly Catholic.
I'm not even sure if that's true, but it may very well have been. But there were other churches that were involved in running these residential schools. But they had power of attorney over these kids. I mean, the Catholic Church, there were young girls where abortions were performed on them by Catholic Church run schools. Why? Because they got pregnant at the hands of some of the staff members and some of the clerical members.
Too much. I know I mean, the dead bodies are, the worst, the worst of it, sort of. You think, oh, well, they died and maybe they got tuberculosis, they weren't cared for, but the enormous amount of abuse, the rapes, I mean, sexual abuse is sort of a cleaned up version for rapes of young boys, young girls, children. I mean, I was reading some of the stories of the survivors. That kind of damage just radiates across our society. Someone from the First Nation chief, I'm not sure I'm going to pronounce her name properly, Cadmus Delorme, or maybe it's a man. I'm sorry about that. The quote there was, all we ask of you listening is that you stand by us as we heal and get stronger. And I'm like, I think you should ask for some more. You should ask for more. Everyone who was abused in these situations needs to be, them and their families, because abuse goes 7 generations down. It doesn't just end. It just keeps going forward. These people need to be supported financially and any other way in their actual healing. Like, in what way should our country support the families of these going to be hundreds, probably thousands of people that were either killed or abused in these re-education camps?
Well, and let's back it up here, because first let's again address what these were for. I mean, they were to destroy Native identity. It's one of the reasons, and you and I, in fact, the first time I was on your show, we were talking about Native mascots. One of the reasons that I get so pissed off over the whole Native mascot issue is that at the same time white kids were beating their oatmeal cans and putting their mom's makeup on their face and playing Indian as a part of their school, our kids, at the same time that this began, our kids were being ripped from homes and were being beaten and tortured, punished for trying to hang on to any semblance of our identity. So even if you didn't have all of the other sexual abuse and physical abuse and all this other stuff, the very concept of these schools was to commit genocide. It was to create a condition that people would cease to exist. Because once they pushed us through these schools, they could somehow claim that we were no longer the ignorant savages that we were when we entered their care. So, I mean, the abuse is psychological, it's physical, it's sexual, and of course there are dead bodies, there are dead children. And look, it would almost seem easy if they could just say it was disease. But
Right.
the fact that it was disease was also tied to the fact that these children, even though many of them worked long days, almost as migrant workers in farm fields, they were malnourished. They often would die of any number of injuries or treatable ailments had they had proper medical care, and they didn't. And
This goes
look,
back to the Catholic thing. I mean, one of my questions for you, John, we kind of got in there already. I see you shied away a little bit from crucifying the Catholics, but I will
I'm
not.
not shying away from crucifying the Catholics.
One of my questions was, what is it about Catholics that they perpetrate so much genocide and horror? And one of the things I was watching recently was some coverage of Mother Teresa, who was held up as this saint, but was actually horrendous and didn't treat these poor people that she could have easily treated with. She just let them suffer. And part of the Catholic Church thing is like, the more suffering, the closer you get to Jesus. And you know, it's like part of their doctrine that suffering is good. It's great.
Well, and inflicting suffering is good. I mean, look. There's the Crusades. There's all kinds of things historically that the Catholic Church has been intimately involved. Look, you know, the atrocities that came with Columbus's voyage was all sanctioned, if not promoted, by the Catholic Church. The doctrine of Christian discovery, all of that stuff is Catholic Church dogma that other churches subscribe to. I mean, you know, as the church broke up into various types of Protestant religions, those Protestants had some of the same problems. And look, we hear a lot about the sex abuse in the Baptist churches, other Baptist churches, and that kind of stuff. So I'm not giving the Catholics a pass. I mean, at the end of the day, they are the foundation of all of this stuff. And you're right. What is it about Catholics in particular, but frankly Christianity as a whole, that could endorse this level? Not just endorse it, but participate. And again, we're not talking about complicity. We're talking about actively involved.
The hypocrisy. The hypocrisy. That's what gets you.
Well,
and they tell you you're bad. I mean, I'm an ex-Catholic, and I am proud to be an ex-Catholic. It is. I feel that it's actually I don't want to call myself a hero, but it's a brave stance to say, okay, I'm going to let go of everything that was actually dear to me because this organization is so vile and disgusting. It's like, but they do their damage when you're little. They start telling you that you're horrible and disconnect you from yourself, which is, they do it to their own followers. What they tried to do to the First Nation people, they try to disconnect you from your own connection to yourself. So that's a whole nother.
Right, and we still have the conversation with folks who think that the fact that Native people lost lives, land, liberty, all that stuff to a Christian nation, that somehow it was a fair trade because we got the Bible out of the deal. I mean, there are people that we still have those conversations with. I mean, getting back to your original question though, I don't know what the government can do. I mean, because there's a question not just what they can do, but what they're willing to do. You look at the debate that's happening in the right versus left now. You've got Republicans who are suggesting that it is wrong to even teach true history if it's going to make white people feel bad. So
yeah.
What could we possibly, expect out of the U.S. government or the Canadian government? I mean, the Canadian government threw some money at people, at survivors, but the conditions that Native people live in on Native territories, it still is like third world conditions. I mean, we have the highest poverty levels, we have the highest suicide rates, the highest teen pregnancy rates, the highest substance abuse issues. These didn't happen all by themselves. We were not a desperate people who needed to be saved by the federal government or the Canadian federal government. We had very, very successful cultures that developed, and we had sophisticated languages, and so many parts of our identity were, was really sophisticated by almost any standards. I mean, but even if it wasn't, the fact that we now live in conditions that are policy driven. I mean, there's the reason poverty exists on native territories is because that was intended to be that. I mean, they used to say a reservation wasn't a place for native people to live; it was a place for people to die, and those conditions were created, to do just that. And now, I'm not suggesting that we should end our, the whole what they call the reservation system, but because I think we need to maintain our integrity, and our identity is tied to land, even for all those people that have been displaced from their land through the removal period and so many of the other, atrocious policies of the United States. But look, we still fight. We're in a battle with New York State because the governor of the state of New York is trying to get $1 billion out of the Seneca Nation on top of the billion he's already gotten out of their gaming enterprises. That $1 billion means a hell of a lot more to native people on a small territory than it does throwing another droplet into the bucket of debt that that New York State creates. So we're fighting the state and the federal government every single day. And so regardless whether you put a couple of native faces in federal government or state government or whatever else, oftentimes we get paid lots of lip service. I think back. Do you remember when McConnell once said in addressing reparations for Black people? He says, "What do you mean reparations? We gave you a Black president." I mean, you. So
a Black president who could have done more.
You want to go there, but you know what? I don't want anybody to think that Deb Haaland is reparations for us. That doesn't solve the problem. She's there. We didn't elect her. I mean, she was elected by white people down in New Mexico. Let's be clear about that. And she was appointed by a white guy, another white guy, rich, old white man, in a White House built by slaves. I mean,
but at this point, we're not going to, it's not going to not be that way at this point. But the fact that she's in there and that these stories have to push her, do you know what I mean? These stories can be used, like so much upsurge in activism is happening right now that it's incredible. And that there is someone there who everyone who is native would be like, you got to do this. You know what I mean? They're not going to, like, I don't know, AOC. They're not going, which they could, I guess, but they're not going directly to Biden, the white guy. They're saying, you ran on this platform. Now you're going to do something. And I think that's better than before she was there, even if she's not there as a hero. It provides an in a certain way because of politics.
She's there at the pleasure of the president of the United States. It's his agenda that her job is to maintain. Look, the Keystone XL,
which is interesting because he is Catholic. So when they bring up like there's a lot of dead bodies on some Catholic land here, that'll be interesting to see.
I mean, when has he made a statement on this issue yet?
No, I don't think so.
No, of course not. But I mean, look, this is where this gets very, very difficult because. Again, Deb Haaland is serving at the pleasure of the president of the United States. We didn't place her there. I don't want anybody to think that she is the salvation. We've had native voices speaking out. Look, I'll tell you right now, we have been much more a beneficiary of the Black Lives Matter movement than Deb Haaland being appointed, to be the native face for Joe Biden.
Mm-hmm.
I mean. Since the murder of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd and the rise of the Black Lives Movement, look, we saw Christopher Columbus statues being toppled right alongside those Confederate statues. Mm-hmm. We saw the Washington football team drop its name, not because they wanted to, but because financial interests said, look, we got to pay attention to the social movement that's happening here. And we can't continue to sponsor a team with a racial slur for a name. So we have been the beneficiary of the Black Lives Matter movement, and I feel more empowered by allies and a movement by the people than anybody sitting in any of those positions.
I'm glad to hear that, John, and I'm glad to hear that. I mean, I'm just glad to hear that this is coming up in the papers, in the main papers, not just the side paper or the local paper or the Catholic Defend Itself paper. I don't know what it is about me, but this story
But here's the problem though, and
Yeah.
I gotta say this. Look, I'm glad it is too. I'm glad it's getting exposed. But the problem is, our people have to relive the trauma with every story that breaks.
I
I mean,
wondered
when
about that.
this last story that broke with 751, bodies discovered. I mean, every time I hear another story, and we're going to hear as long as they keep looking, they're going to keep finding bodies. Why? Because this was pervasive on both sides of that imaginary line that divided our land. So that's, as long as they keep looking, they're going to keep finding. And every time another story breaks, I mean, when they start, if Deb Haaland genuinely does initiate an effort to locate unmarked graves, or even tally up the marked graves, is it going to get the same coverage? I mean, you brought it up. Is it easier for New York Times to cover when they say, look what happened in
It's
Canada,
Canada.
than
Yeah.
when they say, oh, but Carlisle Indian School, there are records. I mean, there's this, I think it's called a Merriman report or something like that details a lot of the atrocities that took place on the US side. I mean, they only have to read their own writing at this point. And you know what? Anytime I hear something about, there not being documentation, the Catholics wrote every goddamn thing down. And
Yeah.
I'm being, that was a pun, the goddamn thing.
It was goddamn what they did. Yeah.
I mean, they wrote everything down. I mean, so to suggest that there's not documentation is just, it's not just absurd. It's a bald-faced lie.
So yeah, because Native Americans already know what happened to them. So
we knew
I understand about the re-traumatization.
We knew children were missing. I mean, and those children, let's again put it in perspective. Those children were the relatives, the friends, and the colleagues or peers of my grandparents, my great-grandparents. They were children, but those children are the ages of our elders now. So I mean, we knew that
once you
children left and never came back.
I work with victims of trauma in my social work life, and it just goes right straight down the generation. I mean, one missing kid is enough to destroy a whole town. I mean, it's.
But again, I got to remind you, this was about destroying families as a whole, because families were the problem that the United States had. Because Native people, through our families, we're learning our languages, our culture, our traditions, all that stuff. We were maintaining our identity through our families. So regardless, I mean, every child who went to these schools died some. Every one of them had part of their identity, their person, stripped away and removed, if not killed. Kill the Indian, save the man. So, we had, and we're talking about something that existed for 100 years. So we had generations of children who didn't know how to be mothers, didn't know how to be fathers, didn't know how to nurture, didn't know how to, to do some of the basic things like tell their own child that they love them or hug them and that kind of stuff. We had generations of this going on. So when you talk about trauma, my generation, my kids will still feel some of this stuff, not because I didn't know how to nurture my children, but they're going to run into this time and time again. And we have to live with the false telling of history, because this stuff isn't talked. I mean, look at all these nut jobs who are trying to ban states from teaching critical race theory. Mm-hmm. I go back to this, and I know I've mentioned this to you before, but how do you hold up Abraham Lincoln as the great emancipator when a week before the Emancipation Proclamation came into effect, a week before that, his execution order saw 38 Dakota hung in Mankato, Minnesota, the largest mass execution in the history of the United States. But nobody teaches that. Nobody teaches about residential schools. Nobody teaches about, not just the mass murders that, that occurred to Native people, but the ones that took place to Black people. I mean, Tulsa now is in all the news, but you know what? Tulsa happened over and over and over again.
I know it seems like we should be way ahead of this. I mean, anyone who's on our side, like on this sort of this awareness side, anyone who read any Zinn, anybody, once you hang out with all these folks who are semi-like-minded, it's like shocking to be like, what? You don't know? It's like a drop in the bucket for you think, hey, people should already know about this, but they don't. And now they're starting to, which I try to focus on. Hey, maybe somebody's going to wake up one of these days and it's better than, but it's, I get that is a hard stance to
Well,
take.
I know one thing. The first thing we need as far as Native people is for the oppression to stop. I mean, it's great to look backwards and say, oh, look how bad it was, but it's still going on. I mean, we have people living in some Native territories where fossil fuels are being extracted out of there, oil, natural gas, and yet people freeze to death every winter in some of those territories. I mean, how is that even possible? But and again, people want to. When I hear anybody suggest, well, if you want to see socialism as a failure, all you got to do is look at Indian country. Look, what we are experiencing isn't socialism. What we are experiencing is
Capitalism and racism.
And imperialism, oppression. I mean, what we are experiencing even still today is a policy that has not ended. The genocide didn't end with massacres. It didn't end with residential schools. It hasn't ended, period. We are right now, if you ask any politician, is it right for them to claim us as their citizens? And they say, oh, absolutely. Yeah, we made them citizens in 1924. What do you mean? How did you make us citizens? I mean, did you offer citizenship? No. You know what they did in 1924? They declared that all Native people within the continental United States were hereby U.S. citizens. Well, that is a war crime. That's called denationalization. I mean, along with the assimilation programs, when you flat out pass a law that says people will no longer be citizens of their own nations, they are hereby citizens of the United States. I mean, that was in 1924. There was already conversation about denationalization being a war crime. 1924 was before the word genocide was really coined to replace this idea of denationalization. But the United States isn't held accountable. And I'll tell you, these residential schools, they may predate in their origins the any kind of UN proclamation on genocide, but they were going on into the 1970s in the United States and 1990s in Canada.
John, thank you so much for being on the program. I think your point of view, your insights are the kind of things that people rarely hear about outside of sort of the circles that we run in. So I do encourage everyone to go check out John's podcast. It's called Let's Talk Native. You can find it where you find podcasts. John, you're also the host of Resistance Radio with John Kane and Regan Loggans on WBAI and WPFW. Those are Pacifica Network channels. So check those out as well. Thanks again, John. Hopefully you'll follow up with us as this story continues to unfold.
Yes, and I appreciate you covering it and inviting me on your program.
Thanks again, John. Thanks. I appreciate it so much.
Thank you.
You're watching Act TV. Stay with us. John, thank you so much for coming on the show. Sometimes when I talk to you, I feel like maybe I'm missing the mark on some of these conversations.
Oh, there's a reason. Look, there's ignorance and then there's willful ignorance. And the problem is everybody's ignorant because you have been deprived. Your education deprived you of this knowledge. I mean, and that's just a matter of fact. I mean, look, when I do live events in New York or any place else, I get people with their master's degrees and their PhDs, and they say, I can't believe I didn't know this. Well, the information is available, but you have to want to look for it. You have to know where to look for it or what to look for.
So that's why I think it's good that it's going in the papers now. I think that
it is good, but again, I gotta say that I know Native people I know people who are triggered by every story that comes out in the paper, and it's tough. I am perfectly willing to talk about this, and more than willing to talk about this because I think it's important that people understand it. But it's
how do we handle this though? How do we do it in a way that makes this story and these stories and the Native story become really as looked at as sort of what's happening with Black Lives Matter, right? We know the stories now of what's happening over there, but this is the first time this is really broken through in my, so I feel how can we handle this so that people who are getting triggered as they as they watch. What do you think is the best way to handle this? Because I think it's really important to get this into the mainstream of discussion, but how do we do it in a way that is supportive of folks
It's
who are
tough
affected?
because I mean, how do you be sensitive to people who are still triggered by it? And that's really what it comes down to. And it is tough, but you know what? I mean, even things like our healthcare, we have look. I live on the Cattaraugus territory, Seneca Nation. We've got a pretty good clinic, but you know, in order to get healthcare in that clinic, we we are forced to apply for Medicare or Medicaid first, and then Indian Health Services will pick up the rest. The reason that that we are entitled to healthcare is because 99% of our land was given up for it. I mean, that was the bargain, right? The bargain was, yes, there's the United States is going to continue to provide certain things, and it wasn't like we had much of a choice in the matter. But they have welched on Welsh. That might be racist to say Welsh, I guess. But they have.
Is it about the Welsh? I don't know.
I don't know if it is.
Maybe.
You know, I've
They Italianed out on you. No, I'm just kidding.
They Columbused us. Yeah. No, I mean, but it is. I mean, why should I have to apply for social services at the state level when this is an obligation the federal government should? And along with that, there should be more mental health care. I mean,
obviously,
look, we have the highest rates of depression, the highest rates of suicide, the highest rates of substance abuse and chemical dependency, and there's a reason for it. I mean, when your lives have been diminished in the way that they are, and look, part of what these schools did wasn't just about converting us to Christians. It was first they had to teach us that who we were was a terrible thing. That we had to be ashamed. We had to disavow and dislike the Native identity. And schools both on the U.S. and Canadian side, they boasted this. Well, the first thing we do is we teach these children to detest their Native heritage, and that's how they get us to Now, whether that actually gets accomplished or not is another question. But that's not to say that you don't carry the scars of that. So, I mean, there are a lot of Native people who carry not just rage, and justifiably so, because we're still experiencing some of that oppression. So, look, I don't know what the answer is, but at some point, things like maybe recognizing our sovereignty would be a start. And we can talk about what the United States owes us, or Canada owes us. I mean, look, I'm friends with so many people in Hawaii that, how do they address the fact that their lands were illegally occupied in essentially a military coup, and nobody owns any of this stuff? So that's what's so difficult when we talk about things like critical race theory. If the United States won't own any of its atrocities, I mean, I heard somebody say, well, they teach about slavery. No, they don't. They teach about the ending of slavery. They don't. I mean, they talk about the heroes, even if it's Tubman or Frederick Douglass or Abraham Lincoln. They teach about those who ended slavery, but they don't teach about the atrocities of slavery and what was really involved in slavery. I mean, including the rape culture. I mean, if you're not going to teach, I mean, yeah, it got exposed that Thomas Jefferson had children with Sally Hemings, but those children were slaves. I mean, they may have been the house Negroes, but they were still slaves. And so you don't address any of that stuff. Then you get somebody like Donald Trump says, well, what are we going to do? Take down George Washington statues because he was a slaveholder? Yeah, maybe we should. And maybe we should expose some of the
wouldn't it be awesome if there were statues of actual slaves, like to remind us that we should not do that again? And
well, look at the statue. There's one in Boston. I think there was one in Washington or Virginia someplace that has Lincoln standing there, and it's got a slave on his knees below him. And if you look at it at the right angle, it looks like Lincoln is petting him. And those statues have been removed. But it was supposed to be the statue, because if you look at it closely, it looks like the chains have been broken. So it's supposed to be the statue that, again, it praises Lincoln. Look at the statue in front of the Museum of Natural History in Manhattan. It's got
Oh yeah.
Roosevelt all buff with big, big biceps.
I'm sure he looked like that. Yeah. Right. He'd been working out at the
He's got a
White
naked
House.
black man and a near naked native person carrying his stuff for him. I mean,
Yeah.
and that statue is completely anachronistic. It never existed. That doesn't represent anything in history other than trying to heroize, Teddy Roosevelt, which
propaganda from it was the Fox News of the times in statue form. John, I have to go so I can edit this and get it out there, but I'm wondering, this was supposed to be like, not, this is just us talking, but there's so much in it. Can I put this out there?
Yeah, anything you want.
All right, you're gonna have to come back because this is a great conversation.
Well, anytime you'd like, I would be happy to join you.
I hope that you're well, and
I am. My family's well. I haven't been to New York since March of 2020, so
yeah,
I'm still not traveling a whole lot. But and look, our territory here, Native territories, got hit hard by by COVID-19. We had the highest loss of life, and not just in Navajo territory, even here in Seneca territory. If you do the numbers, we probably had our percentages were as bad as Navajo, but nobody reports. Again, there we go.
Here we are. Act TV, we're the only one reporting. Well, hopefully we can help somehow. Thanks a lot, John. I appreciate it. I'm glad you're well.
Thank you. Hey, I know we haven't spoken, but I know you're a mother and all these other things. Then all that happened since we initially met. So congratulations.
Thank you so much.
You take care of yourself. It's
you too.
Talk to you.
Talk to you soon. Right. Bye-bye.
Bye.